Ye Bookes Of Cerebus, the comic art of Dave Sim and Gerhard. Just by way of introduction, I'll give you a little bit of background about the Cerebus project, the Cerebus comic book series. It began in December of 1977 as a parody of the popular Olean barbarian comic book. But quickly thereafter, in retrospect anyways, Dave Sim, our writer, who's to the left of me, really evolved quickly as a writer and creator and an illustrator, and began tackling some very broad themes, especially for comic books, such as politics, religion, gender relations, and creators' rights. With issue 65 of Cerebus, he was joined in the creation of the comic book by background artist Gerhard. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say I really took the comic book and the series to a completely different level, and a level of consistency and quality and detailed drawings and creations of those who have been the gallery have already seen. For those of you who don't know, Gerhard is sometimes too pessimistic about the work that he did, and which is pretty remarkable for anyone who's seen it. And over the course of the years, then they were both together and separately were nominated for numerous awards in lettering and inking, Best Cartoon Series in a comic book series in '92. And most recently, they were awarded together the 2005 Schuster Award, which was named after one of the co-creators of the Superman comic book series, Joe Shuster, who was a native Canadian. They were awarded the 2005 Schuster Award for Best Canadian Achievement in Comic Books for the entirety of the Cerebus project, and that was just in April of 2005. By the time the series came to an end with issue 300 in March 2004, Sim and Gerhard had worked together for over 200 straight issues of Cerebus. That number more than doubled the previous record for a writer-artist collaboration, which was 104 issues, I believe, of 102 issues. Well, it's a couple of issues. 102 issues of the Fantastic Four, from 1 to 102, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in the early 1960s. So, what is this Cerebus comic book of which you speak? I see that. Basically, the Cerebus series followed the main character, Cerebus the Artist. He's the little gray guy that you'll see on a lot of pages in the exhibition. And the intent, really from the outset, was to document one character's life as part of the growth process. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's an end. The character Cerebus died in issue 300 that came out in March 2004. And over the period of the series, Cerebus was many things. He started out as a barbarian during the parody of the Conan barbarian era. He was a prime minister, he was a pope, he was a house guest, he was a tavern guest, he was a bartender, he was sort of an aimless wanderer, a companion, an autocratic ruler, and then really finally a political commentator.
He just couldn't hold a steady job.
And each one of those sort of eras, I guess, of Cerebus' life and the Cerebus storyline are collected into trade paperbacks, or what is known among Cerebus readers lovingly as phone books, because they're oftentimes as thick as a phone book, much thicker certainly than many trade paperbacks that are on the market. And those phone books in the Cerebus series itself were published by the company Art Mayhem, which is owned by Dave and Gerhard. So not only were they producing this comic book series, and producing this achievement, they were also publishing it and had complete control over it, therefore. And then the income that generated. Not only were they juggling the various roles of the artistic creators, they were also juggling the roles of small business owners. Quite adept, I might add. Both Dave and Gerhard are also active in contributing to charities within the industry. They have been constant vocal supporters of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund since its inception, I imagine, as well as the organization ACTOR, which stands for A Commitment to Our Roots, that assists veteran comic book creators who have fallen on hard times. And in fact, just over a year ago, in June of 2004, an internet auction of the very first issue of the Cerebus comic book, #1 in pristine condition, was signed by Dave, since he was the one who worked on that particular issue, and sold online for $10,600. And all of that money was donated to ACTOR.
Did you get all these parts yet?
I have. These are the parts that I need. So let's talk a little bit about the Cerebus series. The exhibition really focuses on 3 of the trade paperbacks in the series, all of which actually are post 200. So we're looking at artwork that's from the last third of the series over a period of years from 97 to 2003. And as you enter the West Gallery, sort of goes in chronological order, counterclockwise. You go right to your left, and we see pages from the story, Rick's story. At the point that Dave began work on Rick's story, the writing of it, as I understand it, you had really no formal religious background. In your childhood, you were raised as an atheist and a secularist, and at some point decided that you were going to do a parody of the Bible as part of the larger graphic novel Latter Days, which we'll talk about in a second. And that will conclude, the Latter Days storyline concludes the 6,000-page Cerebus storyline. So in preparation for that, you bought a facsimile, the 1611 King James Bible, and began to study its Jacobean language, just as you would study the writings of Oscar Wilde for the earlier graphic novel Jot's Story, and as you then later studied the writings of F. Scott Fitzgerald for the text pieces in the graphic novel Going Home, and studied Ernest Hemingway for the graphic novel Foreman Bogey. You said that you expected the Bible to be a collection of fairy tales and myths, but found that instead you seemed to have found an actual record of historical events, many of which seemed to be miraculous in nature. And the immediate results in the writing of the storyline was the transformation of the character Rick Nash, who had earlier appeared in Jot's story as Jot's husband. The transformation of Rick into a prophet, or a near prophet, or perhaps a drunken, crazy person who would say things and hear voices. And that makes a lot of sense as you read these pages and you go around and you're never quite sure which one it is. So this section that's featured in the exhibition is where Rick begins to write down his experiences from his own point of view in this sort of Jacobean prose. And later on, that section becomes known as the Book of Rick and takes on some significance in the Cerebus storyline. So having sort of set all this up and taken the floor for far too long, I guess the question that I would have is sort of two-parted. What do you remember about this earliest experience of writing pseudo-scripture? And 2, how do you see this part of the storyline, the Book of Rick, part of the storyline, now 7 years later, 7 years after having written and produced?
I would say that the first experience was, of course, reading the Bible for the first time, and I think I was maybe about 20 pages into Genesis, and I went, this is the real deal. This is a documentation of actual historical events. But was also struck by a number of different things. I mean, expecting that this was sort of like the rule. This was going to be, how you're supposed to live, do's and don'ts and whatnot. I thought it was basically just the Ten Commandments elaborate and religious life. There was a number of different interesting things. I mean, there was the fact that wedding ceremony wasn't in there. And I thought, well, where did the wedding ceremony come from if it's not actually, part of our Western civilization, and such a core part of it, and recited. So you always assumed I always assumed it was scriptural. But I was also, at the time, mostly concerned about, if this is truth. As I said very early on, I thought, if this isn't truth, this is close as I'm going to get to it. That it had very little to say about marriage. It had very little to say about the do's and don'ts of interactions between men and women. And as a matter of fact, just reading the Bible as a chronological record, starting from Genesis and working all the way through Malachi, and then reading the Apocrypha, and then reading the Gospels, it was actually, I was wondering if you can ask Rick, so I wrote down, it wasn't until I got to chapter 19 of Matthew, there's the dialogue between Jesus and the disciples, which, as I read it in the King James, was, "Whoever shall put away his wife except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. Whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." His disciples say unto him, "If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry." But he said unto them, "All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which are so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive, let him receive." And I realize probably not all of you are Christians, so I'll just sort of prevail upon your patience just a little more. The original Greek, word for word English transliteration of that is actually even more mysterious and more sort of obscure. Who likely might divorce the women of him not upon fornication? And these are the sorts of things that I've been noticing, is things like how not upon fornication became for fornication in the popular translations, and might marry another commits adultery, are saying to him, the disciples, "If thus is the cause of the man with the woman, not is bearing together to marry." And I don't really know what "not is bearing together" means, but it seems far more open to more interpretations than it is not good to marry, not is bearing together to marry. Now I'm listening. However, said to them, "Not all are making room for the word, but to whom it has been given, are for eunuchs out of womb and mother were generated thus, and are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by the men, and are eunuchs who made eunuchs of themselves through the kingdom of the heavens." Now missing, being able to be making room, let him be making room. I'm not sure if that points in the direction of celibacy, but that was ultimately the conclusion that I came to for myself, was that having been married and then divorcing, it seemed to me that what the text was saying is, if you try it and it's not your kind of thing, don't just run around marrying people and divorcing them in sequence. Become a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So this all came later. This is the ultimate conclusions that I came to for myself. But in the case of Rick, it was a matter of this sort of permanently heartbroken individual having had the disastrous end to his marriage with Jaka at the end of Jaka's story, and had obviously adopted the other viewpoint. Let's just indulge in essentially serial fornications, and the fact that he ends up getting involved with a woman that Cerebus had been involved with, and Cerebus is essentially discouraging him on the basis of what he now knows about this woman, Joanne. But because Rick is now, as you said, either going crazy or becoming a problem, is now taking what Cerebus is saying about Joanne specifically and is translating this into a sense of women generally. And at the time, that was what I was interested in. I was in my last relationship at the time, and I was reading the rule book and going, okay, I think this is the truth, and was saying, I hope this doesn't tell me at some point that I have to break up with Susie, because I'd really rather not. And that was ultimately the conclusion that I came to. It's not a game. You either commit to it or stay out of the game completely. But at the time, it was basically saying this is a lot of what I thought I was going to be reading in the Bible. These are the things that young men should be wary of when dealing with women. And so it was very interesting to take my own experiences with love is not a universal good, it's got its downside as well, and to translate it into this Jacobean prose that I've become so fond of. Because whether the 1611 King James is a literal translation, it's beautiful language. If it's not exactly expressing what I think the Bible is trying to say, it is magnificent language. Shakespeare, beautiful.
To me, some of the most interesting parts, especially of Rick's story, are because if you've already looked at the pages, you'll see there's a column of text and then sort of two columns that are the comic book language, I guess the visual language, and you can read in it what Cerebus is saying to Rick or what is happening. And then either before that or after, on the page set up, you'll read this Jacobean language. And it's rewarding. I mean, I know it's somewhat more difficult, I think, in a gallery setting, because you're so used to just looking. But you'll read this as a comic, and, it's a rewarding thing, because you get to, the payoff, I guess. You'll read through this Jacobean prose and have read what the story is actually depicting, then you'll see either the disparity or Rick's own unique take on it, and there's a lot of humor, I think, born in that. And Rick himself, ultimately, at the end of that part of the storyline, leaves it all behind. I mean, he leaves Cerebus behind, Joanne behind, all the entire situation that he'd been living in for a while, which was a situation very familiar, I think, to college students, which is just drinking a lot and going out and partying and seeing worried about that.
Yeah, and that is one of my core beliefs at this point, is that as far as I can determine, Don is far more interested in what your core belief is, if you actually believe in God, and if you are trying to please God, which is why at that point that you're talking about in the story, when Rick leaves and has decided this is no longer the great Cerebus, the great Cerebus that he thought was educating him actually turns out to be on the other side. It is because of Rick's core belief and his decision to do good, to not just pay lip service, which I think is a lot of the times the problems with faith, is that you always have to be saying, it's one thing to say that I believe these things, but do you live them as well? You talk, but you have to walk the walk as well.
Yeah, it's where the rubber hits the road.
Where the rubber hits the road.
Well, that's a great segue to sort of the next part of the story. So if we're walking around the gallery, Rick's story ends, the pages of Rick's story ends right where sort of the title of the exhibition is. And then immediately following that, we get into the pages from another storyline, actually, in the Cerebus sense, as far as how it was published, was several years later. And that's the graphic novel Latter Days. So there's this gap of time in the storyline. 2 graphic novels worth, if you're counting at home, and then we get to Latter Days. And unknown during this period of time to both the reader and to Cerebus, the character, this book of Rick, this Jacobean prose that Rick has written, is beginning to be widely read and disseminated, and is beginning to be treated as a sacred work and a guide for living. And so doing some of the good that Rick hoped he would do. So even as unknown to the reader and unknown to Cerebus in our world, every Sunday during this period of time, Davidson is reading aloud and sequentially one of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, or as I think Christians probably know them, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So during that gap of time you read the Pentateuch, it says here 10 times?
Yeah.
And more times.
In the last perhaps,
Yeah. So many times straight through the 5 books. So gradually behind the scenes in the storyline, the Book of Rick is becoming universally accepted in the fictional world of Astarsion, which is this sort of continent that the entire grand Cerebus storyline takes place on. Then eventually it's only a matter of time until Cerebus, as Rick wrote in the Book of Rick, the great Cerebus, or the great Cerebus as Rick now as Christendom in the Book of Rick, is discovered and ensnared within this blossoming faith. And very much to his surprise and against his will, is soon treated as the undisputed head of his faith, of the faith. This kind of combination parody of Saul of Tarsus or St. Peter. His disciples bear an uncanny resemblance to these Jews. And at that point,
that seemed kind of appropriate that Cerebus, his disciples would be the 3 Stooges.
And then a little bit later on, a character shows up who calls himself Königsberg, the not-so-good Samaritan. And he, as you notice in the gallery, looks just like Woody Allen. And he brings Cerebus Torah scrolls, Torah as we know in our world, Torah scrolls, and tells Cerebus that an ancestor of his, who was known as the really coming along okay Samaritan, had been instructed by the prophet Rick that at the moment the age of unrighteousness was at an end, and that the sort of age of Cerebus began, that Königsberg should bring to Cerebus the scrolls of the Torah as Cerebus would read and interpret them and decipher their true meaning. So that leads us into these sections that are on the walls in the exhibition where Cerebus proceeds to do this and create his own interpretation. And for those of you who've been there, or for those of you who have been Cerebus readers, that's the really teeny tiny type that's next to the illustration.
Pages and pages and pages of teeny tiny type.
Lots and lots of type, but still Cerebus only gets as far as chapter 38 of interpreting Genesis. This covers 80 pages of type, and then sort of augmented and referred to allegorically in much the same way as the Rick storyline. You can read all this text and see how the illustrations both refer to and perhaps create the joke of all this. There's that great back and forth that only in comic books between the text and the imagery. So that's what's going on in this part of the storyline. And I think I was safe in saying that the context of those 80 pages, as Cerebus interprets Genesis, would be pretty unfamiliar to any follower of both Orthodox and Reformed Judaism, Catholic or Protestant Christianity, or basically anyone besides me. Anyone besides the author, yeah. So, there you go, that's what's called a spot. So let's, I'm interested in your recollections, thoughts, anything you might like to remark on now about all that.
Yeah, that was, again, the original intention with buying the King James Bible and getting it in the Jacobean prose was to just learn the writing style, to be able to write comfortably in that voice. But the idea up ahead was past these two intervening storylines where Cerebus goes off with Jaka and basically has his dream relationship of his life, which doesn't end very happily. And then becomes ensnared in this now blossoming religion. The idea was, okay, this is where I will do the parody of the Torah in addition to the Book of Rib, which is in Cerebus' world. We will assume that there is Judaism, and they do have the Torah as we know it, or the Pentateuch, actually, the first 5 books. And this will be the point where the parody comes in, because Cerebus is obviously, as far as you can get from the great Cerebus, he's the obnoxious little gray, walking id. So in showing him the Torah, he's going to read it and interpret it in such a way that whoever I end up casting, and it ended up being Woody Allen, would just be staring away with his head, completely rattled by, this can't be what it actually says. But in order to do that, I had to read the Torah, read the Pentateuch and become familiar enough with it in order to do a parody of it. To say, okay, what is this? What are these books saying? And the more that I sat down and wrote out what it is that I think these books are saying, ended up being at least 180 degrees away from, as you say, Orthodox Judaic or Reformed Judaic or any form of Christian belief in what the Torah is saying. So the clock is ticking, and I'm getting, I think, further along in understanding what it says, but now I'm having to do the more complicated thing of saying, this is what I think it says, now I have to make fun of it. And I thought, the problem with that is, if I'm the only one reading it this way, nobody's going to know what I'm making fun of. So then I thought, okay, let's take it back a step and say, instead of Cerebus making fun of it, let's just have him say what it is that I think the Torah is saying. That is, so completely at odds already with the conventional interpretation. And that's pretty much what I came up with. The difficulty was that it's one thing to have notebooks full of little scribbled notes going verse by verse and say, this I think actually refers to this, and this hooks up over here, and to get it sort of a mental map made of it. And then another thing to be sitting in a computer terminal going, okay, here's how you explain it to somebody else. And that got to be a real problem, because it was, you've got to print these out and say, okay, how much space is left over for pictures now? It's like, boy, not a whole lot of space. And that was compressing it. That was, when I started off, I thought, well, I'm going to have to explain all of this. I'm going to explain Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It was all I could do to get through to chapter 38 of Genesis, so I sort of tacked on a few of my favorite ones from Exodus and whatnot, just at the end when Joanne's flipping through and I'm reading the entire text. But, it was, for somebody who spent most of his career really pushing the envelope of his reader's patience. It's like, I was about 5 pages into that and went, boy, you're really asking for a lot of indulgence from atheists here. We got a few of them sitting down front here. Is that right? I was really pushing them. Yes, man.
And we would have done the original plan. We would have gone to Cerebus issue 400.
Issue 400, yeah. And I knew I couldn't pitch that to Gerhard. It's like, we're going to have to go to issue 400 because the commentaries are going to come out right.
We're 4 point tight.
That's right, 4 points, I think.
One of the ones I called half of your issues on the comic book readers in comic book stores said, is this a comic? I mean, really, is this a comic?
Why are all these words? This is a comic book.
Well, I started experimenting with that way back in Jocka's story, and they already felt hard done by then, so this was one of those, well, you think you had grief then, should this?
But again, it's rewarding because if you go through this and you read it and you see and I imagine this was another part of the problem, it's not only how much of this do you present, 38 chapters of Genesis, but how do you present your point of view, and how do you make this dialogue with Cerebus talking to Königsberg being transcribed by, as it's referred to, me, which would be David. How do I make this interesting? Like, and there is this interesting conversational sort of way that this is done that you don't think reading scripture is common. You think, oh, all of a sudden I just read more scripture straight than I read. Well, maybe this is just me, but then I read really straight sitting in one sitting before. It's sort of like when you have to give dogs their pills and put it in peanut butter. And they're like, that's better.
That's we got to do an advertising campaign right there.
Yeah.
That's right, Cerebus is the peanut butter for your scripture. Makes it go down smooth.
On that note, we'll sort of go into we'll start talking about the pages that are, if you go to the door, and they're all on the right-hand wall. These are 30 pages, I think, of the 40. From one issue, there's actually a double issue 289, 290, so very, very now, close to the end of the Cerebus storyline, where we get Cerebus's, basically it's an illustration of a dream that the character Cerebus is having during the last night's sleep that, as it turned out, he'll ever get ever again. And this dream is a retelling of the story of creation. And in this case, it's bringing together elements from Genesis, from the Quran, serves from the Quran. You'll know there's footnotes, and you'll see that they'll note the particular surah, and modern science as well, that we sort of up to the minute cosmological.
And the first chapter of Jonah. This is a Christian university.
And the first chapter of Jonah. So lots of stuff being stirred together here. And I do want to point out, this actually is continuing a broader theme in Cerebus. Over the 26-year period, there have been 2 other sort of retellings, in the sense of the story of creation and how everything sort of came to be. And those were, I think I'd say, a lot more secular, not a whole lot of religious input in those pictures. So now we get, okay, now that Dave's read the Bible, now that he's read the Quran, now that he's thought about this and done the research, what does it all mean? And that sort of is the way that the last graphic novel called The Last Day begins. Sort of bringing together, as I said, the Bible and Stephen Hawking and all this stuff. It really is pretty extensively footnoted, all these scientific excerpts about the Big Bang, the birth of stars, embryology, the chemical composition of blood, and cross-referencing these to scriptural verses from Genesis 1, John, and the Quran. So it's really it's a master's degree or something, and your own theology or theologies. It's a lot more.
It's so fascinating. It's like, I have to give me the degree to go, you want me.
Yes. It's a lot more research than I did for my master's degree. Anyway, so what these things you're doing is disagreeing with the secular idea that we sort of started off with discussing, that the Bible is fairy tales, we add science there, and that now we're in the 21st century, our scientists have sort of figured it all out. At one point he cites Stephen Hawking's quote that, I know what the universe is doing, I just don't know why it's doing it. And then there's like another little footnote there saying, Dave saying, well, if you can tell me what the universe is doing, I think I can tell you why it's doing it. As I say, chutzpah. Yes.
Yeah, at that point, it was very interesting because now we're really, to use a hockey analogy as a Canadian, we're in the last minute of the third period, and I was finishing up Latter Days, which was a 700-page book, which is all about, again, the Torah commentaries and how Cerebus becomes the head of this religion. And just had this, and had realized, okay, I'm going to have to pull this all together in the last book and establish